We remember their legendary voices, their unmatched screen presence, and the way they defined what it meant to be cool. We assume that because they lived under a constant spotlight, they were somehow protected from ordinary human frailty. But the brightest stars often hide the most vulnerable truths. Behind the unforgettable performances and the decades of applause, some of history's most beloved icons faced a sudden silent finish that caught the entire world entirely off guard. Number 1. Cary Grant. Everyone remembers the suit. The impeccably tailored, dust-covered gray suit from North by Northwest as he dodged an attacking crop duster with a kind of irritated elegance that no other actor could possibly pull off. That image is the absolute definition of mid-century Hollywood cool. But the man wearing the suit spent his entire adult life outrunning a ghost. Cary Grant was a masterclass in self-invention. Before he was the archetype of the sophisticated American leading man, he was Archibald Leach, an impoverished kid from Bristol, England. His father committed his mother to an institution and simply told young Archie she had gone away a truth he didn't uncover until he was in his 30s. That foundational lack of stability dictated everything that followed in his professional life. When you look at his career from the rapid-fire banter of His Girl Friday to the psychological tension of Notorious, you aren't just watching a performer read lines. You are watching a man meticulously construct an impenetrable armor of charm. He was notoriously exact about his lighting, his wardrobe, and his contracts. In an era where the major studios owned actors lock, stock, and barrel dictating who they dated and what they wore, he became one of the very first to break the system and operate as an independent freelancer. He didn't just play Cary Grant on screen. He manufactured the persona to survive an industry built on using people up. He once famously quipped that even he wished he could be Cary Grant. He held on to that polished image well into his 80s, long after he stepped away from feature films. In late November 1986, at 82 years old, he was traveling the country doing a one-man conversational show. It was a stripped-down setup, just him, a stage, and an audience asking questions. While preparing for an evening performance in Davenport, Iowa, that lifelong ironclad control finally gave way to sudden physical reality. A severe stroke incapacitated him backstage, and he passed away within hours. There was no slow, publicized decline. The curtain simply dropped in an instant, leaving intact the perfect, unbroken illusion of the most sophisticated man to ever step in front of a camera. Number 2. Grace Kelly. Alfred Hitchcock once famously described her as a snow-covered volcano. But to the American public in the mid-1950s, she was something much simpler. She was the closest thing the country had to actual royalty long before she ever set foot in Monaco. Her entire film career lasted only 5 years. She made just 11 movies. Yet if you ask anyone who went to the theaters in that era to define Hollywood elegance, her name is almost always the first one mentioned. What made her so captivating wasn't just her undeniable beauty. It was the intense, almost unapproachable stillness she brought to the screen. In films like Rear Window and To Catch a Thief, she didn't demand your attention with loud theatrical performances. She simply existed in the frame, projecting an air of quiet authority. When she walked away from the studio system at the absolute peak of her fame to marry Prince Rainier III, the media aggressively sold it as the ultimate modern fairy tale. But the reality of becoming Princess Grace was far less cinematic. She essentially traded the rigid contractual control of MGM for the even more restrictive protocols of a European royal house. It was a lifelong diplomatic role, where her primary job was to be flawlessly photographed, boosting a tiny principality's economy through her sheer star power. By all accounts, she took her royal duties incredibly seriously, but she also quietly mourned the end of her acting career. The crown was heavy, and the public demanded perfection every time she stepped out of her front door. The absolute composure she maintained through decades of relentless public scrutiny made the circumstances of her passing feel completely surreal. In September 1982, while navigating the winding steep roads of the French Riviera roads, eerily similar to the ones she had driven in, To catch a thief, she suffered a sudden, mild cerebral event at the wheel. That unexpected stroke caused her to lose control of the vehicle, leading to a fatal accident. She was 52. The abruptness of it broke the comforting illusion that such a carefully curated, heavily protected life was somehow immune to ordinary human fragility. She left behind a legacy that is entirely unique. A woman who played a princess on screen became one in life and remained the gold standard for grace under pressure. Number 3. Betty White. Most people tuning into television in the 1980s saw Rose Nyland, a wonderfully naive, sweater-wearing woman from Minnesota who could derail an entire conversation with a baffling story about Saint Olaf. That character was so convincing, so thoroughly endearing that it entirely masked the reality of the woman playing her. Betty White was not a sweet, easily confused bystander in the entertainment industry. She was a razor-sharp pioneer who understood the mechanics of television better than almost anyone else in the room. Long before it was standard practice, she was calling the shots. In the early 1950s, she produced and starred in her own sitcom, Life with Elizabeth, becoming one of the very few women in Hollywood with total creative control on both sides of the camera. When network executives in the Jim Crow era pressured her to remove a black tap dancer, Arthur Duncan, from her national variety show, her response was swift and uncompromising. "I'm sorry, but he stays. Live with it." She built an 80-year career not by being lucky, but by being adaptable and relentlessly intelligent. She survived the transition from radio to early television, navigated the golden age of sitcoms, and eventually embraced modern internet virality. She managed that incredible longevity largely by weaponizing her own harmless grandmotherly image to deliver perfectly timed, often biting, comedic punchlines. She always knew exactly what the audience expected of her, and she knew exactly how to flip it for maximum comedic effect. The entire country was actively counting down the days to her 100th birthday. Magazine covers were already printed on newsstands. Celebrations were already scheduled. But biology doesn't consult a calendar. On Christmas Day of 2021, she experienced a mild cerebrovascular accident, a quiet stroke that didn't immediately seem severe but subtly shifted the trajectory of her physical health. 6 days later, on the final morning of the year, she passed away comfortably in her sleep at her home in Brentwood. There was no prolonged hospital stay or dramatic public decline. It was a remarkably gentle exit that brought a sudden quiet close to an unmatched 8-decade run, reminding an entire generation of how incredibly rare it is to share a laugh with the exact same person for an entire lifetime. Number 4. Debbie Reynolds. When she was 19 years old, she spent her days on the set of Singin' in the Rain dancing until her feet literally bled. Gene Kelly was a notoriously demanding perfectionist, and she wasn't a trained dancer at all. But she hid the pain, kept smiling for the cameras, and essentially willed herself into keeping up with the best in the business. That sheer unyielding grit became the defining characteristic of a woman the press preferred to label simply as America's sweetheart. Behind the bright, bouncy musical numbers and the wholesome on-screen persona, Debbie Reynolds was an absolute survivor. The entertainment industry and life in general threw incredibly heavy blows at her. When her husband, Eddie Fisher, very publicly left her for Elizabeth Taylor, it was the biggest tabloid scandal of the decade. She navigated the intense humiliation with remarkable public grace. When subsequent marriages left her in financial ruin, she didn't quietly fade away into retirement. She went out on the road performing live cabaret shows in Las Vegas for 40 weeks a year to pay off massive debts she hadn't even created. She also recognized the cultural value of the studio system long before the studios themselves did. When MGM casually auctioned off its own history, she spent her personal income buying up thousands of classic costumes and props. She was single-handedly trying to preserve a golden era that corporate executives were eager to throw in the trash. She was a woman built to endure almost anything the world could throw at her. But there is a strict biological limit to what the human body can withstand when it comes to emotional trauma. In late December 2016, she faced the sudden death of her daughter, Carrie Fisher. The psychological shock of outliving her own child was profound. Just one day later, while at her son's home arranging funeral plans, the immense emotional pressure manifested physically. She suffered a severe intracerebral hemorrhage. The stroke acted quickly and she passed away that same afternoon. After a lifetime of surviving public scandals, financial collapses, and the brutal demands of Hollywood, the one thing she simply could not outlast was the loss of her child. Number 5. Gene Kelly. When you picture the classic Hollywood musical, you don't usually think of a guy in a tight t-shirt and loafers performing with the aggressive intensity of a middleweight boxer. But that was exactly what made him revolutionary. He didn't float across the ballroom floor in a tuxedo, he pounded the pavement. Gene Kelly completely rewired the DNA of American dance on film. He was a fiercely intelligent choreographer and director who recognized that the camera shouldn't just be a passive observer capturing a stage routine. In masterworks like An American in Paris and Singin' in the Rain, he used the lens as an active partner. He brought a muscular blue-collar athleticism to an art form that had previously been defined by effortless aristocratic gliding. Off-screen, he was a famously demanding taskmaster, a man who operated with a relentless drive for perfection, pushing himself and his co-stars to their absolute physical limits. He wasn't just dancing to entertain, he was actively working to legitimize the male dancer in the eyes of the mid-century American public framing movement as a display of undeniable strength and endurance. For someone whose entire identity, career, and cultural significance were built entirely on supreme physical control, the circumstances of his passing carried a heavy irony. The boundless kinetic energy that defined his youth eventually had to give way to the realities of aging. In 1994, he suffered a stroke that fundamentally altered his mobility, grounding the very man who used to leap effortlessly off street lamps. A subsequent stroke the following year left him largely bedridden. He passed away quietly in early 1996 at the age of 83. The loss of his physical independence was a quiet fade out, but it did absolutely nothing to diminish the sheer joy he put on screen. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, his image remains permanently suspended in midair, forever holding an umbrella, forever defying gravity. Number 6. Lauren Bacall. She only had to drop her chin look up through her eyelashes and deliver one single line about knowing how to whistle. In that exact moment in 1944's To Have and Have Not, a 19-year-old former model named Betty Joan Pursk vanished, and the smoldering, instantly iconic Lauren Bacall was born. It is arguably the most famous cinematic debut in American history, largely because she projected an intense self-assurance and a smoky voice that seemed entirely too experienced for a teenager. But that signature expression, the famous look, was originally born out of pure, unadulterated stage fright. She kept her chin pressed tightly to her chest simply to stop her head from shaking nervously while the cameras rolled. The studio system immediately capitalized on it, aggressively marketing her as the ultimate mystery woman. However, her career narrative was quickly overtaken by her off-screen reality. Her marriage to Humphrey Bogart set the gold standard for Hollywood romance. They were the ultimate mid-century couple, effortless and undeniably cool. Yet being half of a legendary partnership came with a heavy professional cost. For decades, the press and the industry viewed her primarily as Bogart's widow, rather than a standalone powerhouse, a massive shadow she had to aggressively fight to step out of. She absolutely refused to quietly fade into the background when the golden age of film noir ended. Instead, she shifted her focus to Broadway, winning 2 Tony Awards and proving she had the formidable talent to anchor a live production without relying on studio lighting or her husband's legacy. She was famously direct, unapologetically opinionated, and fiercely protective of her own independence in an industry that constantly tried to manage her image. She maintained that sharp, uncompromising edge well into her late 80s, holding court in her apartment at the historic Dakota Building in New York. In August 2014, just weeks shy of her 90th birthday, she experienced a massive stroke at home. The vascular event was overwhelming, taking her quickly and decisively. There was no protracted hospital stay, just a sudden halt to a brilliantly loud and fiercely lived life. The deep voice was finally silenced. But she left behind an image of unshakable confidence that still commands the screen today. Number 7. Richard Burton. Richard Burton possessed an instrument unlike anyone else in the industry, a booming, classically trained Welsh baritone that could effortlessly reach the back row of a Broadway theater without a microphone. That voice was so commanding it felt almost structural, anchoring massive historical epics and intimate stage dramas alike. But the man producing that sound spent a lifetime trying to outrun his own immense talent. Born into a working-class coal mining family in Wales, he was heavily recognized as the most gifted Shakespearean actor of his generation. Yet, for the American public tuning in during the 1960s and 70s, his stage pedigree was completely overshadowed by the sheer chaotic spectacle of his private life. When his romance with Elizabeth Taylor erupted on the set of Cleopatra, it didn't just sell tabloid magazines, it effectively invented the modern paparazzi industry. They were a cultural phenomenon living with a level of diamond-studded, globe-trotting grandeur that made traditional Hollywood studio public relations look entirely obsolete. The public simply couldn't look away from the drama of their two turbulent marriages. What often gets lost in the spectacle of his fame is the deep internal conflict that drove him. Burton was a fierce intellectual and a frustrated writer who fundamentally disdained film acting, often viewing his movie career as a highly lucrative, but slightly humiliating compromise. He relied heavily on alcohol to manage the massive insecurity of never quite feeling worthy of his own reputation. He was a man actively fighting a war against his own success, using his phenomenal wealth to insulate himself from a deep, persistent melancholy. A lifetime of aggressive overindulgence relentlessly eroded his physical foundation. By the summer of 1984, his legendary vitality was visibly diminished. While resting at his home in Switzerland, he experienced an acute, massive cerebral hemorrhage. The vascular failure was severe and sudden, leading to his death at a hospital just hours later at the age of 58. The stroke instantly silenced the most powerful voice of an era, bringing an abrupt curtain down on a spectacularly complicated life. He wasn't just an actor reading lines. He was a brilliantly flawed force of nature who completely rewrote the rules of celebrity. Number 8. Rue McClanahan. When television producers were casting a new sitcom in 1985, they originally envisioned Rue McClanahan playing a sweet, scatterbrained widow from Minnesota. After all, she had spent years on television playing nervous, slightly mousy characters on shows like Maude and Mama's Family. But a last-minute casting switch handed her the role of Blanche Devereaux instead. In a matter of weeks, an intellectually sharp Oklahoma-born theater actress completely transformed herself into the ultimate unapologetic Southern seductress, and in doing so, quietly rewired how American television viewed women over 50. Before, the Golden Girls Network television had a very strict unspoken rule about aging women. They were supposed to fade quietly into the background, wearing sensible cardigans and dispensing gentle advice. Rue completely shattered that expectation. She brought a vital, vibrant, and incredibly comedic edge to a demographic that the entertainment industry usually treated as invisible. What made her performance so brilliant wasn't just the sequins or the exaggerated Georgia drawl. It was her sheer fearlessness. She made extreme vanity deeply endearing largely because she played it with absolute sincerity. She showed millions of older viewers that life, romance, and personal agency do not suddenly expire at retirement age. Off-screen, she was a deeply pragmatic working actor and a dedicated animal welfare advocate far removed from the persona she perfected on Saturday nights. She navigated the massive global fame that came to her late in her career with a very grounded mindset, knowing exactly how rare a genuinely great role truly is in Hollywood. Her later years brought a few significant health hurdles requiring her to step back slightly from the public eye. In June 2010, while recovering from a minor health issue, she experienced a massive cerebral hemorrhage. The severe stroke acted quickly, and she passed away at the age of 76. Her sudden departure brought a heavy collective wave of nostalgia to a public that felt they had lost a close friend. Yet, through endless nightly syndication, she remains exactly as she intended, vibrant, hilarious, and eternally convinced she is the most captivating woman in the room. Number 9. Bill Paxton. In the middle of an intense, high-budget science fiction nightmare on an alien planet, one Marine completely loses his composure and screams, "Game over, man, game over." That single moment of unhinged panic in 1986's Aliens cemented Bill Paxton as the most relatable guy in Hollywood. While other actors were busy trying to project fearless heroism, he had the absolute brilliance to play sheer terror exactly the way a normal person would. Paxton wasn't a product of the old studio system, but to audiences navigating the massive blockbusters of the 1980s and 90s, his face was as essential as any classic leading man. He built a remarkable career out of grounding massive, unbelievable spectacles in everyday reality. Whether he was chasing tornadoes in Twister, navigating the claustrophobic tension of Apollo 13, or searching the ocean floor in Titanic, he provided a crucial anchor for the audience. He didn't have the unapproachable polished glamour of a traditional movie star, and he actively used that to his advantage. He possessed a distinct blue-collar authenticity originally shaped by his upbringing in Fort Worth, Texas. Directors trusted him implicitly because he never allowed the special effects to overpower the humanity of the scene. Off-camera, he was widely regarded as one of the hardest-working, most genuinely decent people in the industry, quietly transitioning into a highly respected director and television lead without ever losing that signature Texas grit. Because he always projected such a rugged, dependable energy on screen, the news of his passing in early 2017 caught the public completely off guard. At the age of 61, he underwent surgery to repair a damaged heart valve. The procedure was followed by severe medical complications leading to a fatal stroke just days later. It was a sudden and deeply jarring halt to a constantly evolving career. The loss felt distinctly personal to millions of viewers. Bill Paxton never just felt like a celebrity on a movie screen. He felt like a neighbor you were always happy to see. Number 10. Luke Perry. In the early 1990s, network television decided they needed a modern James Dean, so they put a leather jacket on a young actor from rural Ohio and told him to lean against a Porsche. The instant he appeared as Dylan McKay on Beverly Hills 90210, Luke Perry became a highly manufactured global commodity. For viewers navigating their own youth and early adulthood at the time, that brooding stare defined an entire era of pop culture. But the most interesting thing about Luke Perry wasn't the massive television mania he inspired. It was how completely he rejected the ego that usually accompanies it. Underneath the carefully constructed bad boy image pushed by the network machinery, Perry was remarkably grounded. He viewed the entertainment industry through a deeply pragmatic lens, treating acting as a job that required showing up on time and treating the camera crew with the exact same respect as the studio executives. While the media relentlessly tried to trap him in the narrow category of a teenage heartthrob, he quietly focused on longevity. He deliberately took on gritty, independent projects, Broadway roles, and voice acting, actively dismantling the pristine commercial image that made him famous. By the time he returned to mainstream television in his 50s playing a grounded father figure, he had successfully transitioned from a poster on a wall to a genuinely respected character actor. Because his early career was so fundamentally tied to the illusion of eternal youth, the news of his medical emergency felt entirely surreal. In late February 2019, he suffered a massive ischemic stroke at his home in Los Angeles. The sudden vascular event was overwhelmingly severe, and he passed away just days later at the age of 52. It was an abrupt halt that served as a sharp, sobering reminder of human fragility to a generation that had grown up watching him. Yet, in the days that followed, the public conversation rarely focused on his television fame. Instead, the industry was flooded with quiet, unprompted stories about his immense personal kindness, leaving behind the incredibly rare image of a Hollywood phenomenon who succeeded simply by being a decent man.